5 employees from the University of Puebla were excited about the weekend, as they were planning to go on a hiking excursion. They wanted to climb a dormant volcano nearby called La Malinche to spend Independence Day in the mountains. But almost immediately, things didn't go as planned. They wanted to leave earlier around the morning, but they were waiting for another group of employees who planned on joining the team. However, they cancelled last minute, leaving only the 5 and delaying their trip until the late afternoon. The 5 were Julian Gonzalez, Roberto Rojano, Jesus Carrillo, Ramon Gutierrez, and Miguel Flores Cruz. They bought their bus tickets and headed over to the bus terminal in the energetic capital of Puebla, which is also called Puebla. It was already around 5:30 p.m. and they noticed that the sky looked very cloudy as if it was about to rain. So they quickly entered the bus, headed for the recently constructed highway that connected the capital to a town at the skirt of the volcano. Their destination, San Miguel, Canoa. It was a very small and quiet rural village. Most of the population were natives who didn't speak Spanish. The town's name was believed to come from colonial times. 2 irrigation channels used to surround Canoa on both sides, so evangelists used these channels to spread their religion by a canoe to the native village. The evangelists named the village San Miguel after the patron saint, St. Michael, and Canoa because of the help from canoes. The bus was filled to capacity, most likely containing lower-class farmers and vendors returning from the busy commercial district. The employees, excited for their trip, started singing but were told by a man to quiet down. They finished the song, looked outside the window, and saw that beyond the cornstalks was the great La Malinche, with dark clouds surrounding it. The employees were soon dropped off in Canoa, but almost immediately at 6 p.m., a huge storm fell upon the village, caused by the dark clouds. This delayed their hike and forced them to seek shelter in a nearby store. Despite the gloomy rain, they didn't let it crush their spirits, and they were still determined to climb the volcano. So they waited for several hours, hoping that the storm would die out. But when it didn't, they asked the owner of the store if he had a room that they could borrow or rent for the night. The store owner politely declined due to limited space, but he suggested for them to talk to the local priest or Canoa's municipal president to see if they had any available lodging. So the group hurried outside into the rainstorm, and given the 2 options, they decided to rush over to the church. Well, to be specific, only 3 of the men were going to the church. Julian Gonzalez and Ramon Gutierrez went searching for batteries needed for the flashlights because they were unprepared. Miguel Flores Cruz, Jesus Carrillo, and Roberto Rojano headed to talk to the priest. It was directly north of the store and a lot closer than the municipality. When the team of 3 arrived, they encountered some people posted outside like guards. They wore overcoats and sombreros to protect themselves from the rain and to cover their faces. The group told the guards that they were there on a trip to climb the volcano and simply wanted some shelter for the night. They asked the guards if they could have a word with the priest.
So will you let us talk to the priest?
No, not here. You can't stay here. Get out or else you guys won't be leaving here.
Well, who are we bothering? Is it a crime or what?
Get out!
Not wanting to get blasted with a shotgun, they left the guards alone and returned to the store they had just left in disappointment. Meanwhile, Julian and Ramon had bought fresh batteries from a store and made their way to the church. The route they took led them to a different entrance to the church that the others didn't go to. When they got there, they greeted the guards and asked politely to see the priest. These guards were much friendlier and summoned the priest for the 2 employees. During their interview with the priest, Enrique and Massacre asked them for identification. They didn't have an ID on them, but they told him that they were employees from the UAP, the Autonomous University of Puebla, now known as the Meritorious Autonomous University of Puebla. It was the oldest and largest college in the state. The priest looked at them for a brief second, staring into their eyes. They could sense something was off, that they shouldn't have mentioned that. Mesa denied the request for shelter. He sent them off and turned away, closing the door behind him. Right next to them was the captain. Julian Gonzalez turned to him and pleaded for him to give him a single night of shelter, even if it was in jail.
Well, yeah, but I'll have to lock you up.
Yeah, lock us up as if we were messing around or whatever, and tomorrow you just set us free.
Actually, I don't think you can. The president isn't here. I can't put you guys in there. But why don't you go talk to the guy who owns the store over there? He has an extra room and he might be able to rent it out to you guys for the night.
They walked to the store in sadness, because that was the exact same store they had already been to. It seemed like shelter for the night was not going to come too easily. They met up with the other members of the group, who had returned to the shop when they were rejected. They talked to each other and discussed what they were going to do next, but they got frustrated and carried on bad moods. It was already nighttime and still raining with no signs of stopping. They weren't sure if they wanted to leave the village because they were already there and it would be worth waiting for when they eventually climbed the volcano. But they knew that they couldn't sleep on the streets, and this town didn't offer them a place to stay at. So they eventually decided that they were going to return to Puebla and left the store. However, when they went to go back to the bus drop-off, they couldn't find any bus to return them. So they kept walking and found a small store. There, they got some drinks, talked about their situation, and danced to the jukebox. Finally deciding to return to Puebla, they came up with a plan to visit their friend who owned a ranch on the outskirts of the city. That way they could still have fun for the weekend. They approached and asked the store owner.
Hey there, sir. Where can we find the returning bus to the city?
I'm sorry, there's no more returning buses. It just left.
The guys looked at each other in disbelief. They were essentially stranded.
You know, if you want, there are cars that come drop people off, and they return to the capital empty. You guys can take one of those.
The group was relieved. This was their only hope out of here. Now, all they had to do was wait. As the storm continued, a bus arrived, dropping off its last passengers. 2 men and 2 women entered the store. To be specific, it was Pedro Garcia, his 2 nieces, Maria and Josefina, and a young man named Odilon Sanchez. As the employees were talking, the newly arrived group were hearing everything, from the return to Puebla, to the church, to the shotgun. Eventually, Julian Gonzalez saw another opportunity. He was getting really anxious at this point and approached Pedro Garcia, telling him about their predicament and asking if he knew anywhere they could stay at.
So what do you say? Do you have some place?
If you want to climb the volcano, there's no problem. I'll take you to my brother's house. I don't live here. I live in Mexico City. I'm here to collect some change from him, but we'll talk with my brother Lucas and we'll stay over there. I'll even join you. We can even hunt some rabbits.
Julian turned to his coworkers.
So what do you think?
Jesus and Ramon declined. I think it'd be better to stay at the ranch. We'll be better off there. However, the others insisted.
We already started the trip. We're already here. We might as well finish it.
Why don't we do something? Let's take a vote. Those who want to leave on one side, and those who want to stay the other.
No, it's better if we do this instead. Eagle, we leave. Sun, we'll stay.
They all agreed. The choice was made. They were staying. They were going to climb La Malinche like they had originally planned, and even made a friend which seemed impossible in this unfriendly town. Everyone got one last drink and started walking to Pedro's brother's house, which was about 1 mile in about 15 minutes. When the employees and their newly acquired friends arrived at Pedro's brother's house, they knocked, and Lucas Garcia, the brother, welcomed them with open arms in his small one-room house. They met his wife, Tomasa, and their 5 children. Lucas apologized for the inadequate living space, as he didn't have much to offer them, not even a bed. But the employees reassured him that it was no problem, as they were very much used to stuff like this. Julian invited everyone to a cigarette, and Miguel gave the girls some cookies. For the next hour, they would talk pleasantly and get to know each other a little more. And apparently Lucas also had some bad experiences with a priest. He had an overwhelming debt of the last harvest because he hadn't paid the 10% to the church since his piece of land was too small. So he gets visited by the priest's men every so often and has to constantly argue with them. It seemed like this was truly a friend they could trust, and they were very thankful for coming across Pedro when they did. But everything was about to change. Around 10 p.m., the employees were on the roof with Pedro, looking out into the stars peacefully, as the rain had already stopped a couple hours beforehand. Then, they heard something.
What was that?
Well, since tomorrow is Independence Day, perhaps they're getting ahead of themselves since everyone is most likely drunk. They're probably firing shots.
And suddenly, Lucas yelled to the guys to come back down. As they waited, the gunshots didn't seem to stop. And then, they heard something truly terrifying.
Someone must have died. The church bells only ring that way when someone's dead. Let's just wait it out.
Attention everyone. The great town of San Miguel has been infiltrated by agitators, students, communists, and thieves.
What's going on here?
It's what the priest does. He takes land from people who don't pay him the harvest.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm sure. Why don't you guys get some rest?
And so he handed out mats to everyone to lay down. But as they were trying to sleep, they couldn't help but hear the loudspeaker outside. They kept shouting things both in Spanish and Nahuatl. So the employees couldn't understand everything that was being said. Hey Lucas, what are they saying?
It's nothing. Things of the Father. They're stirring people up, that's it.
Yeah, but what do they say?
Nothing important.
Well, let's go help them, no? Let's see what's going on.
No, don't go. They're just stories the Father says to scare people. Don't get yourselves in any trouble. Some 15 or 18 days ago, some students came to Canoa to protest. They were members of the CCI. I'm sure you guys know about that. They came in a truck from the university nearby. Heard some guy got off the truck and took some chickens. The Father's been pretty mad since, so that's probably what it is.
A few moments later, as they were still trying to sleep, they heard some movement outside. Miguel went outside to use the bathroom, and when he came back, he said that there were a lot of people outside. Everyone was pretty calm except for Jesus, who was shaking and nervous. They reassured him that they didn't do anything wrong and that they were probably passing by. Around 5 minutes later, they heard this on the loudspeaker.
Everyone, let's meet at the church. We're all going to Lucas Garcias' house where the murder and thieves are.
Everyone in the house paused in disbelief. They all panicked and started grabbing their things.
What did you guys do?
Nothing, we swear. We already told you everything.
Okay, Pedro. Take them down to the ravine. They won't do anything to you guys there. From there, head on to the city.
They reached for the door, and when they opened it, they found themselves completely surrounded by people, wielding torches, shotguns, machetes, and other makeshift weapons. They closed the door immediately and started panicking and arguing with each other. Lucas started yelling through the door, telling the mob to calm down, that they'll come out but to not harm them as they hadn't done anything wrong. But the mob didn't care. They threw rocks, shot the door, and someone was starting to break the door down with a hatchet. The employees searched for hiding places within the house, but there was no escape. A few minutes later, the door had finally been forced open, and the mob rushed inside, turning to Lucas. Lucas, who was holding a shovel, defended himself, but was overwhelmed. He then received a machete blow to his neck and a shotgun blast to his chest. He died immediately, in front of his wife and kids. He fell to the ground, and the mob dragged his body outside. His wife started screaming, along with her children. Someone walked over and started beating her, but she and her kids managed to run away, seemingly spared by the crowd, most likely because she had her kids with her. The rest of them were now cornered. The mob was now pressuring the group, asking where the communist propaganda was, how many there were, where the car was, but no matter how hard they tried to reason with them, they were met with sticks, machetes, and hatchets. They looked around, but they weren't able to find Pedro Garcia. He actually managed to escape without anyone noticing, and blended in with the mob. and they would have all died right then and there if it weren't for a police officer who appeared in front of them. He tried his hardest to convince the mob to take him to jail, but they instead grabbed him and took him outside. The employees never saw him again. Eventually, Ramon and Jesus tried to make a run for it, but they didn't make it very far, not even to the door, as they were beaten to death. The remaining employees were pulled outside only to be beaten continuously with everything the mob had. Roberto and Julian collapsed to the ground. However, Miguel was resilient and stood standing as he was further assaulted. He had an amazing endurance to pain, even when he was hit by machetes to the head. With Roberto and Julian being dragged by ropes and Miguel standing, he saw Odilon Sanchez next to him fall as his head was blasted with a shotgun. Miguel's relentless beating continued as he received multiple blows to the head. Meanwhile, Julian overheard a man saying that he was going to slice him with a machete, so instinctively, he put his hand out, which blocked the blade, and severed 3 of his fingers before the blade cut into his forehead. Now they were at the main plaza of Canoa, the same place they had first arrived in. Miguel overheard that once he would fall, they would light them all on fire and dump them in a canyon so the police wouldn't know. So, despite being overwhelmed, he stood his ground. Then, they hit him in the ear, which dazed him for a moment, but he stood straight again. It was only then, when they started burning him with torches, that he felt lightheaded and fell to the ground. And for about half an hour, they only hit him, calling him the devil because he was so resilient. When they were done, they felt the bodies of the 3 men. They were cold to the touch, and they had concluded that they were all dead. However, in reality, they were all very much alive, and they were keeping still to look dead. It was because of Miguel that Julian and Roberto were still alive. And then they felt something cold touch them, some liquid. The mob poured gasoline on them, and they were ready to light them on fire. And that's when police showed up. The mob was actually considering killing them as well, but the police pushed on, and Miguel, with all his strength, got up and would meet the police, despite being grabbed and beaten relentlessly. Miguel went on to say that he really thought his friends were dead when he left them there, and if he knew they were still alive in that moment, he wouldn't have left them. The ambulance wouldn't show up for another 10 to 15 minutes, and in that time, both Roberto and Julian would make sure to not show any signs of life, and because the mob thought they were dead, they allowed them to take both of them to safety, although the ambulance wouldn't leave until Miguel got on. He struggled as the mob would let him through, but ran with the medic to the ambulance, joining Roberto and Julian. The lynching in Canoa lasted about 2.5 hours from the moment the church bells rang. Lucas Garcia, Odilon Sanchez, Jesus Carrillo, and Ramon Gutierrez lost their lives. The survivors, Roberto Rojano, Julian Gonzalez, and Miguel Flores Cruz, received medical attention at a private hospital in Puebla. Now we'll take a look at the aftermath in just a moment. For now, let's explore what really went on in the background that caused these villagers to become enraged. Now, believe it or not, when the 2 employees, Julian and Ramon, left the church after the brief talk with the priest, they were being shadowed the entire time, up until they reached Lucas's house. This group returned to the church and alerted the priest Enrique Mesa Perez, who sent these men. The moment Julian and Ramon told the priest they were employees of the UAP was the moment their weekend hike turned into the worst night of their lives. And that's because of what happened a few weeks earlier. You see, in the 1960s, the Independent Farmer Syndicate, or the CCI, was growing rapidly in Puebla, and the PRI, the corrupt ruling party of Mexico at the time, felt threatened by the power that CCI was gaining. Enrique Mesa was a prominent supporter of the PRI, often condemning the CCI and linking them to communists. 2 to 3 weeks before the lynching, UAP students visited Canoa and held a political rally to generate support for the national student strikes at the time. The student strikes were to directly oppose the PRI and the corrupt ruling practices. On August 27, 1968, in Mexico City's Central Plaza, one student lowered the Mexican flag and replaced it with a red and black strike flag. Now, allegedly, it was reported that the students that visited Canoa hoisted a red and black strike flag right in the center of Canoa, as well as taking chickens, which didn't sit well with the priest, who was at pressure from the student movement and the CCI, which led him to spew PRI propaganda to the churchgoers, reportedly stating, "When communists arrive, you all have to do what you need to do," which explains what Lucas Garcia was trying to tell the employees when they were hearing the loudspeaker.
You know, some 15 or 18 days ago, some students came to Canoa to protest. They came in a truck from the university nearby. Heard some guy got off the truck and took some chickens. The father's been pretty mad since, so that's probably what it is.
And you see, in a lot of small villages in Mexico, The local church acted as the most powerful social institution. The priest was essentially the head of the village. As most of the population was religious, they depended heavily on the church as a place of worship, social gathering, marriage, and cultural life. And the priest was very powerful, acting as the town's power broker and political ally to many local and national governmental figures. Even years later, Mesa declared that Canoa's residents, quote, all obeyed me and respected me. Most of the residents also only spoke Nahuatl, so no one read newspapers or watched television, and only had Mesa to rely on for news. When Julian and Ramon told Mesa that they were employees of the university, this sparked a fire of hatred that was looming inside of him. So he immediately denied them shelter and, well, we know the rest. Without knowing it, these guys were scapegoats to a bigger problem at hand. Now, I mentioned earlier that the police and paramedics showed up to rescue the remaining employees, but I never said how. Well, this is a whole separate incident. On that night, Canoa's mayor, Martin Perez Arce, visited a store which had the only telephone that could be used to contact anyone outside of Canoa. And, fun fact, the store was Pascual Romero Perez's store. And if you recall earlier, this store is the same store the employees were in when trying to find their way to Puebla, but there was no evidence to indicate the employees ever used his telephone booth. Anyways, the mayor placed a call that alerted the Radio Patrol Corps, the Red Cross, and the police in Puebla to all the madness that was happening in town. The next few moments remained unclear, but at one point, Romero Perez, who owned the store, was shot in the stomach. After that call was made, a group created a barricade of rocks in the street that prevented civil authorities from entering Canoa. Julian Gonzalez remembered hearing some members of the lynch mob discussing Romero's gunshot wound, meaning this wasn't just a coincidence. He also heard that one resident, upon hearing the news, speculated Romero felt bad for the employees and placed the call himself, implying someone shot him when they found out he tried helping the employees. If that was the case, then there's a chance that the mayor was part of the group that shot Romero. Julian also heard people speculating that Romero had accidentally shot himself and someone called the ambulance on his behalf, but that doesn't seem very likely. First of all, how do you accidentally shoot yourself in that context? And how would you explain the improvised roadblock that was made, blocking emergency services? The newspaper El Sol de Puebla speculated Romero was shot when some of the lynch mob arrived at his store, maybe including the mayor, and demanded to use his telephone, but he refused. The newspaper also said that governmental reports indicated that Romero had no idea where the shot came from or who it came from. Romero was sent to the same hospital that the survivors went to, and he recovered fine. But this event also serves as an example of how a moment in history can be twisted and changed depending on who you ask. In one's eyes, it was the mayor who shot him. In another, Romero shot himself. That was a very prominent thing during the Pureized rule. And yeah, it even happens today still. So, let's take a look at the aftermath. On the morning of September 15th, the eve of Mexican Independence Day, El Sol de Puebla ran an article on the front page. They tried to raise a red and black flag, and this was the consequence. The article was unsigned and featured an interview with Miguel Flores Cruz, who was the only one conscious in the hospital. He stated that he and the rest of the university employees were confused for students, but the article title states otherwise. The paper also interviewed police authorities, who claimed the residents of Canoa said the employees had arrived in town and wanted to loot a store where they drank, inferring Romero's store. The paper states that the men wanted to place a red and black flag in the church tower, and that was the reason they were attacked. So, as we can see, details of the events weren't exactly accurate, and this differed very much. Excelsior published an article on the same day, declaring all the employees died. A lot of these were pure propaganda, and only a few local Puebla newspapers reported the actual events. On September 16th, Mexican Independence Day, about 100 people attended a funeral ceremony for Jesus and Ramon. It was also used as a way to protest as the university students walked Puebla's streets with anti-PRI signs. The next day on the 17th, at 1:30 p.m., Enrique Mesa Perez visited the military zone headquarters in Puebla due to a morning article published, stating that he was the main man behind the lynching. The paper would get the news from Roberto Rojano, who labeled him as a lynching mastermind. The priest had a conversation with Puebla's military colonel and requested a platoon of soldiers to San Miguel Canoa. That way, the town would be protected from future student attacks. During his visit, Enrique told his side of the story. He said that on that night, he had no idea what happened, because he was in his room due to him falling ill, and because he had hearing loss. He would go on to say that at 9:30 p.m., he heard women shouting, but he didn't know why. He then denied all accusations brought forth on the paper and by Roberto, acting surprised when he was called a lynching mastermind. He then said that despite his illness, he walked out of bed, left the church, and proceeded to calm the villagers down. he firmly believed that if not for his intervention, the surviving members would have been killed. The priest was denied the army request, and the government would see many contradictions in his statement. If he left and calmed the villagers down around 9:30, then surely the angry mob would have dispersed long before it actually ended. And if he had hearing loss, how did he hear a woman shout in the distance? Knowing this, we can clearly see how irrational and erratic Mesa is, and how any imbalance to his power in Canoa would tip him off. The university the guys worked at demanded justice for the employees, everyone from other employees to students to administrators. The university council held a session in the UAP auditorium, with about 140 people present. The group examined the events that occurred in Canoa with the help of Julian Gonzalez, who recounted the whole thing on a tape recorder. They managed to raise 40,000 pesos, and despite the many newspapers shifting narratives, the generally accepted narrative was the story we all saw, from the point of view of the employees. However, not much focus was centered on Lucas Garcia and Odilon Sanchez, the other guys who were lynched. A lot of known stories at the time seemed to gloss over these guys, which kind of makes sense for Odilon, but Lucas played a huge role in this narrative. And speaking of Lucas, his neighbors were able to raise 30,000 pesos to donate to his wife. However, the family never received the money because the priest took the money for himself. Tomasa and her kids stayed in Canoa and continued to go to church. In 1976, she would say, quote, "Canoa is our pueblo. Where are we going to go? We have made a life here. Ma San Pascual gets 20 pesos a day. We live with his 5 siblings and I." With the national student protests in the country, a lot of people wanted Enrique Mesa to pay for his crimes. And keep in mind, this was a huge protest. But unfortunately, Enrique Mesa received 0 jail time, although he was forced to leave his position in 1969 and was sent to a smaller town across Puebla with the money he stole from Tomasa. The political connections he had kept him from being prosecuted or even investigated, so what he got was basically retirement. He would be interviewed many years later, several times. He would say, "I have always been good with the government. Well, Puebla's governor was also a friend of mine. Do you think that if I was guilty, I would be free? I had never been involved in politics. Now, the new priest of Canoa is a nephew of mine. The other day, I went and spoke into the microphone, and in 15 minutes, the entire town was in the church. The people said, 'Why would we not want Padre Mesa?' He would also feel no remorse for what happened, saying, 'Everything that happened that night in 1968, they asked for it. They were from Puebla, and they knew where they were going.' Even ridiculously stating that the lynching started when the employees shot the storekeeper, Romero Perez. His official story would change several times throughout the years. The official investigation in Canoa didn't go too well either. Very few residents spoke with the investigators, and it didn't help that the majority of the population didn't speak Spanish. In total, 18 arrest warrants were issued, but only 5 were charged. The most being 2 people who served 8 and 11 years respectively. Pablo Sanchez received 8 years, but he pleaded his innocence the entire sentence. Panfilo Garcias received 11 years, but he wasn't able to defend himself because he couldn't afford the money, so they threw him in jail. And as it turns out, these men were actually innocent. It's now known that the priest had told investigators to detain only specific people. Reports also showed that the police discovered the mayor, Martin Perez Arce, to be a part of the mob. He was apprehended in March 1969 after they named him one of the key instigators of the lynching. In fact, he was one of the first people to break into Lucas's house. So after hearing this, do you think the mayor shot Romero Perez? Or do you think he felt bad and called emergency services? Today, the only surviving employee is Julian Gonzalez, who appears on TV telling his story. He has since returned to Canoa and was asked for forgiveness from the people. He has chosen to forgive them and holds no resentment for those who attacked him.
La verdad es triste, es lamentable que en el país siga habiendo tanto linchamiento.
Roberto Rojano committed suicide after his wife died, and Miguel Flores Cruz died of leukemia in 2011. As for Pedro Garcia, I couldn't figure out what happened to him after he escaped his brother's house. There is a movie about this called Canoa, A Shameful Memory, made in 1976, which starts off as a mockumentary and transitions into the real events that took place, with about a 90% accuracy. It's a really solid film and very underrated. If you want a more real look into the story, I recommend you check it out. And as for this story, this is where it ends. There's a lot of political and social matters with this story, but I didn't want to talk too much about it. I wanted to focus solely on Canoa and the employees. Before I leave, I want to give a big thank you to my friends for voicing the characters in this. I love you guys, and I love you watching as well. But that's gonna be it. Take care.